Hi there, I'm Russ. Welcome to our latest video, which is document generation using Microsoft Power Automate. So first of all, before we begin, if you're not too familiar with 3Grow, my company, just to let you know what we do, we run public and private training courses throughout Asia Pacific, specializing in the Microsoft 365 suite. So anything from SharePoint, Teams, the Power Platform, as well as third-party tools like Nintex workflow forms, etc., as well as live tiles. A little bit about me. I'm Managing Director of 3Grow. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. I've been a trainer for well over 18 years now. The last 15 or so of those years have been spent specializing in SharePoint and later the Office 365 and Microsoft 365 suite. So within this video, what we're going to be doing is first of all looking at a scenario that we need to achieve. We're then going to look at the various different building blocks that make up that scenario. We'll then go through the various different steps as far as the theory is concerned in achieving that result, and we'll then go through a demo of how all that works together. So the scenario, first of all, this is just an example. Of course, these principles can be applied to any similar situation. In this instance, what we want to do is from a customer record, which in this instance will be in a SharePoint list, we want to trigger an automated process which is going to raise and then send via email a laptop hire agreement. The same principle can be applied to any data source. However, just bear in mind that we don't have a native option for triggering the workflow manually via anything other than a SharePoint list or a library, unless we incorporate Microsoft Power Apps and have the workflow triggered from there. So the various building blocks that we need in order to achieve our solution. First of all, we need a customers list. As we said, in this instance, it's a SharePoint list. However, in reality, it may be a SQL database table or data from Salesforce or Dynamics or some other CRM. Bear in mind, if it is anything, as we said, other than a SharePoint list or library that we're triggering a workflow from, the only way to do that manually is from Power Apps. We also need a document library for the contracts. So this is to store those resulting laptop hire agreement documents. We also need a templates library. So the reason for that templates library is somewhere to store the laptop hire agreement template that the workflow is going to reference when creating a new document. We also need the laptop hire agreement content type. So both in the contracts library and in the templates library, we need that content type to ensure that consistency and ensuring all of the columns and fields are available. Of course, we need the laptop hire agreement template itself, which is going to be stored within that templates library, and we need the Power Automate workflow, which is going to perform all the magic. So the steps. First of all, we need to create and then of course populate the customers list. We'll then create the contracts document library and the templates library, and we'll then produce the laptop hire agreement content type, which will be added to both the contracts and templates libraries. So broken down into a bit more detail, once we've got the contracts library and the templates library, we can then add the laptop hire agreement content type to each of those. Once we've done that, we can then upload the laptop hire agreement template into the templates library. We're then going to populate the laptop hire agreement template with the metadata fields that are provided by that content type, which is going to allow the Power Automate workflow to dynamically populate the contents of that file. We're then going to go back to the content type and point it to the template so that whenever which is not necessary in this instance for the workflow, however, the user may be creating a laptop hire agreement manually rather than through the automated process, in which case that allows them to create that document using the appropriate template. So the steps involved in the Power Automate workflow. What we're going to be doing is triggering the workflow against a specific customer within that list. What the workflow is then going to do is grab all of the information about that list item, i.e. the customer information. There's also some information that the user will provide to the workflow at the point of triggering that workflow, such as the laptop hire start date, end date, and number of days. So we need to convert those inputs into numerical fields so we can calculate those later on within the workflow before they then input into the document itself. The workflow will then create a new laptop hire agreement as a Word document, use the metadata fields from the customer data, but also take the information input by the user at the point of triggering the workflow into that Word document. What we're then going to do is convert that to a PDF, populate the PDF metadata so that when we go back to look for these documents at a later time, they're nice and easy to find. And we're then going to send that agreement PDF to the customer via email. All right, so on to the demo. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at within the demo is just a recap on those various different building blocks that we talked about earlier on. So if I just jump into the site contents of this site I've set up for the purpose of the demo, first of all, we have the customers list. I've just dropped a couple of customers in there for use within the demo for testing purposes. We have the contracts library, currently empty, but I have already added the laptop hire agreement template to that library. We also have the templates library in which we've already stored that laptop hire agreement template. And again, we have added the laptop hire agreement content type to that library as well. The reason for that is when we uploaded the laptop hire agreement template, what we then need to do is insert those fields as quick parts into that template. Those quick parts are provided by the content type. So when we choose to edit the properties of that document, we will see that we have those laptop hire agreement orientated columns that have been provided by that content type. In a few moments, we'll see how to actually add those quick parts, those fields, inside the body of that Word document. But for now, we'll have a quick look at the document library settings, and we'll see that the laptop hire agreement has been added to that document library, which has, of course, therefore brought with it all of those columns. So within this video, we're not going into the process of actually creating the content type and also adding it to those libraries. Hopefully that is knowledge that you already have. If you don't already have a good knowledge of content types, I would certainly recommend it. Content types, in my opinion, are certainly one of the most important aspects of SharePoint when it comes to building an efficient and effective information architecture. So far we have our customers list, we have our contracts library, our templates library. We've added the laptop hire agreement content type to the contracts library and the templates library. We've also uploaded the laptop hire agreement document template into the templates library. The next step is to take the URL of the laptop hire agreement and paste that into the settings of the content type. So if the user in the future needs to create a new laptop hire agreement directly from the contracts library, it can still reference the template for them. Now we don't need to point the content type to the template for the benefit of the Power Automate workflow. The Power Automate workflow will use the template as a starting point from within the templates library. So I've already added most of the fields into the body of that document template. However, there are a few that I still need to do. I've saved those so I can demonstrate that process. So the first thing to do is to open up the document within the desktop version of Microsoft Word. It's worth pointing out that this is something we can only do in the desktop version, not in the browser version. That includes not only adding those fields into the body of the template, but also populating those within any documents based on that template at some point in the future. So here we have the laptop hire agreement template, and you'll notice there are some fields already inserted into this template. I have emboldened those just to make it a little bit easier to see which are the dynamic values and which are the static pieces of text around that within that template. So for example, here at the top, we've input the company name, address, and so on. At the top here, the contact name as well. Further down, we have the hire start date, hire end date, number of days, daily rate, and then the total hire cost. All of these values will be populated by the workflow. There's a couple of bits that we still need to insert, so I'll show you how to do that. So within Microsoft Word, when we go to the Insert tab of the ribbon, we have this Quick Parts icon on the toolbar, and then Document Property. Now, most of these properties are standard Microsoft Office document properties. They're not specific to the content type on which this file is based. However, some of these, of course, are made available via the content type. For example, here we have the contact first name. We can then just drop a space after that, so we can then insert the last name. So insert Quick Part Document Property, and then here we have the surname. I will then insert the company name and the contact job title. Again, you'll notice that all of those we're going to ensure are in bold, so we can easily see those values once we're in the completed document that's been produced by Power Automate. So I'll save those changes, close the template. So now the document template is all set up, what we need to do is ensure that the content type is referencing this template now that it has those metadata fields embedded within it. Now, the most obvious way to generate a link for a document is the copy link option. However, this has sharing aspects to it as well, so it's not going to be a clean URL. The best way to get hold of the direct link to that URL is via the details pane. We can scroll to the bottom down here and we can copy the direct path to that document. We can then go into the document library settings, from which we can see the library's copy of that content type. From here, we can easily get to the site level copy of the content type, which is the parent of the library level copy. Through the advanced settings of that content type, and in here we'll see that we can paste the URL of that document template into the document template property of the content type. Now, this has been set at the site level, so it will obviously filter those settings down to every library within this site that uses that content type. So now we're going to test that the template is working appropriately by going into the contracts library and seeing that we can still create a laptop hire agreement document without using the Power Automate workflow. This will, however, require us to populate each of those fields manually. As I mentioned before, we cannot populate those fields via the browser-based version of Word. We would need to switch to the desktop version of Word to achieve that. Now, we're not going to demonstrate that. What we're really interested in here is how the workflow can populate that for us. Okay, so let's now look at the workflow that we use to bring all that process together. So here within Power Automate, I have already created the workflow. We're not going to be creating that from scratch within this video, just to save some time. So down the left, I can just open up my flows. And here we can then locate the Send Laptop Hire Agreement workflow that I've already created. Let's just jump into the edit mode of that workflow, and we'll go through those steps and clarify what each of those are doing. So the first part of the workflow is always going to be the trigger. Now, in this instance, the trigger is for a selected item. What that means is we are able to manually trigger a new instance of that workflow against any item within the specified list, in this instance, the customers list within the sales site. In here, we've also asked the user to populate certain information as they trigger that workflow. That information being the hire start date, the hire end date, the number of days of the hire, and also the cost per day. We've then used the Get List Item Details action to capture further information about each customer so that we can then use that later on in the workflow. So we've then used some compose actions. Now, the reason for this is, first of all, we need to take the number of days, which was the input by the end user, and simply pass that through the compose action in order to allow us to utilize this in the next function. So because it's seen as a text value initially, we cannot apply numerical functions to it. Whereas once we've passed it through the compose action, we're able to use it in a much more flexible way. So by applying the float function to the output of the previous compose action, that will turn that into a numerical value. We've also done the same thing with the cost per day. We've first of all passed it through the compose function and then utilize the output of that compose function to apply the float function. What we mean by float is a numerical value with potentially a number of decimal places. The next step of the workflow is to create the Word document. To do this, we first of all asked it to grab the contents of the laptop hire agreement template by using the get file content action. We then choose to create a Word document using that content. Notice we've also utilized there's some dynamic fields to build an appropriate file name. And of course, we've asked it to create that file within the contracts library. The next step is to populate the metadata by utilizing a combination of information about the customer against which the workflow is triggered, as well as a calculation to work out the total hire cost by multiplying the number of days by the cost per day. And of course, what that will then do is by populating the metadata, that will feed into the body of the document because we've embedded those fields into the content of the document using those quick parts. Now, the next step is to convert that Word document to PDF. Now, unfortunately, there is currently no out-of-the-box action to convert a SharePoint file to PDF. So what we need to do is, first of all, get the content of the file created in the previous action and use that to create a copy of that document within OneDrive. Once we've created that file in OneDrive, we are then able to convert that file to PDF. Once we have the PDF copy of the file, we can then use that to create a PDF version of the laptop hire agreement that the workflow is producing as a PDF within that same contracts library. So at the end of the process, we'll have a Word document and a PDF copy of that agreement. Now, we no longer require the Word document to live within OneDrive. We needed to simply create a copy of it in OneDrive in order to convert it to PDF. So we just delete that document from OneDrive. And we can then populate the metadata of the PDF copy of that agreement using the same metadata that we used to populate the Word document metadata in the first place. The last step is then to send that PDF agreement to the customer as an attachment. So they're the various different steps that make up this process. What we're now going to do is go back and test this workflow by going into the customers list, picking a customer, and from the menu, any workflow, the Power Automate workflow that is allowed to be started manually against any item in this list will find available on the Automate pop-out menu of that item. And as you can see here, we've got the Send Laptop Hire Agreement workflow. If this is the first time you've triggered this workflow, it will ask you to authenticate those connections. Now, of course, this has all been tested already, so it won't ask me to re-authenticate. However, it will, of course, ask me the same as it will anyone triggering this workflow, which is to populate information such as the start date, the end date, number of days, and cost per day. Having populated that information, we'll run the flow. Now, that workflow is now running behind the scenes. And as it's stepping through that process, we'll see here in the status of the workflow, we'll see it's currently running. And we can even follow it step by step, although it has already finished in this instance. Let's now go and see the end result of that workflow within the contracts library. As we can see here, there is a Word document that was created for Norton & Co. Let's open that up and we will see it has been populated. So here we see the company name, the address, contact name. Further down, start date and end date of the hire, number of days, cost per day, the total, plus the name, company name, and job title. We'll see the exact same thing for the PDF document as well. So if we open that up, we see the PDF copy of that file sitting in the library. So not only has the workflow created both the Word document and PDF copies of that laptop hire agreement, if I go into my sent items, we'll also see a copy of that agreement has been emailed to the customer. So if you found that video useful, please feel free to like, subscribe and share. If you have any questions or if you have any recommendations or requests for any other videos, please feel free to drop those in the comments. Thanks for watching.